Today's daf we're going to be learning is Megillah Daf Lamed. Today's daf is sponsored by the Hadron Zoom group in honor of Becky Goldstein's grandson, Amitai. Amitai finished Shas Mishnayot this week. As Becky wrote, to fill the void felt in Bavel after the destruction of the temple, they found comfort in their Mikdash Ma'at, Batei Knesiot, Ubatei Midrashot. And we, her Hadron Zoom family, take joy in seeing the comfort and pride passed on. Mazal tov. Okay, we are going to get started with the bottom of Kaftet and Mubet, reminding everybody, Siyum on Sunday, Thursday, no regular class. If you want to join the Hebrew Siyum, there's the Hebrew Zoom Siyum on Thursday night. And we will finish the Masechah together in English on Sunday afternoon. And Friday already begins Moed Katan. So we will have regular class on Friday, and the Shabbat daf will go up also as well on Friday for the first two dapim in Moed Katan. And Sunday, by the way, there's regular class as usual in the morning because we're on the daf of Moed Katan. Okay, starting from the bottom of Kaftet Amud Bet. Itmar. We're now going to have, Itmar is usually an introduction to a machloket between two Amoraim. Today's daf is going to be filled with a bunch of different debates between Amoraim. What if, we talked about this yesterday, things similar to this, what if, remember our reading is Kitisa, at least according to what we saw, according to Shmuel, which is the opinion that we hold by. We read from Kitisa, which is about the Shkalim, right? About giving the Shkalim to the temple. There it was for the tabernacle. Now, if that section Kitisa comes right after, it's the very beginning of the Parsha, which comes after the Parsha of Tetzaveh. So what if the Torah reading for that week is Atat Tetzaveh? And then, so the question is, if you read Kitisa at the end, okay, now remember, we talked about this and we're going to see this today, that there were different opinions about, do you read it the entire week, you just read about Shkalim that week, and Zachor, you read about Zachor, etc. Or do you read the regular Parsha, and at the end, you read Shkalim, which is what we do. Now, even we do it a little bit differently, because we read 7 aliyot of the regular parsha, then we have maftir for shkalim, and then haftorah for shkalim. In those days, we saw this yesterday, they actually put aliyah 6 and 7 together. Didn't really say that, but we assume, or somehow split up 7 aliyot into 6. And then the last aliyah, not maftir, but the last aliyah would be the one about shkalim. So what if, let's say you do that, 6 and 1. Let's just assume we're on that option right now. That's what they're discussing. You read the Parshat Tetzaveh 6 aliyot. Then you read Parshat Shkalim. Now, to the average person who doesn't have a chumash in their hand, because in those days they didn't have chumashim, nobody knows that you're reading it because it's Parshat Shkalim. They just assume that you're continuing and you're just reading farther. Maybe they don't know where the Parshiot are split up. And it's not going to be a noticeable thing that you're reading this because everybody needs to wake up right when we read the Parsha. Okay, so we're reading about the Shkalim, very nice, but it doesn't remind me I'm supposed to bring them to the temple. It's just talking about the Shkalim. But we want it to be a reminder that, hey, wake up in 2 weeks. They were setting up those tables and the money changers, and you have to go give your money. So Chali up about Tetzaveh, we're going to see a machlokes between Rabbi Yitzchak, Nafcha, and Abai. Nafcha says, Karushita mivatat tetzaveh ad kitisa. Again, read the entire parsha in 6 aliyot. V'chad mikitisa ad v'asita. V'asita is v'asita kior. That's the next section out in kitisa. Then says you're supposed to make the kior. That has nothing to do with the shkalim. So it means basically read from the beginning of kitisa is aliyah number 7. Basically, Rabbi Yitzchak Nafcha says just continue, right? Continue straight. This, by the way, you wouldn't need a separate Sefer Torah because you wouldn't need to roll it at all. Amr Abaye, Amre, Ukumu dekamok mehatam. Abaye says people are just going to think that you just happen to be there and you read a little farther. They won't realize that this is anything unique for Parshat Shkalim, and therefore he doesn't like the solution. Ela Amr Abaye, what does he say you should do? Karushita mivatat tetzaveh ad ve'asita. Read 6 aliyot from ve'atat tetzaveh through Parshat Shkalim. Basically, read the parsha in 6 aliyot, but include the Parshat Shkalim as if you just continued. And then, v'chad, the last aliyah, tane v'kari mikitisa v'asita. Repeat the last section about kitisa. Now, again, in our world, you say that won't be unique because our maftir is always a repetition of the end of the Torah reading. So it wouldn't look strange. But for them, obviously, they didn't do maftir the way we do, where they repeated the last psukim. And therefore, and this isn't even maftir, this is the 7th aliyah. So basically, the fact that you're repeating it And reading it again shows that everyone will know that you're doing it special because it's Parashat Shkalim. Meitibe. Now we're going to have a question on Rabbi Yitzchak's approach. It says, and this we read yesterday, but we're now going to read it a little bit differently. Chali, and we're going to see it eventually, we're going to say, oh, no. To answer the question against Rabbi Yitzchak Nafcha, we're going to read it the way we read it yesterday. But right now we're going to read it with a bit of a different eye and read it a little bit differently. If Parshat Shkalim falls out on the week where it's the Parsha that's right next to it, whether it's the Parsha that's before it, which is our case, or whether it's the Parsha after it, which would be Vayakel, Okay, the way we're reading this now is it sounds like if this week that we're supposed to read Parshat Shkalim is Va'atat Tetzaveh or it's Vayakel, what do? We read Parshat Shkalim twice. Now, this works perfectly according to Abaye, because what did he say? Add it on to the end of the Parsha and then read it a second time. So that's perfect. So Bishlam al Abaye Nicha. Rabbi Yitzchak Nafcha Kashya, but Rabbi Yitzchak Nafcha, this makes no sense. There's no repetition according to him. You read Atat Tetzaveh for the first 6 aliyot. The 7th aliyah, you read Shkalim. There's no repetition whatsoever. To which the Gemara says, no. You misunderstood the source, or you can read this source in a different way, which is the way we read it yesterday in the Gemara, which is this. Amar lecha Rabbi Yitzchak Nafcha. He could say to you, if you were here, he would answer like this. Ula Abaye minicha. According to Abaye, this source also doesn't make sense. Why? Well, remember, there were 2 scenarios. One is it's Atat Tetzaveh this week, and one is it's Vayakel. If it's Atat Tetzaveh, we repeat, right? Because you end Atat Tetzaveh with Parshat Shkalim. So now they say like this: Tinach lefaneh. If it's the parsha before, it makes perfect sense because you're koflim. But lacharea hechik mishkachala. If you read Vayakel, remember you have all of Parshat Kitisa, which happens to be a very long parsha. The very beginning is Shkalim. Now, if you're going to start with Vayakel and end with Shkalim, there's no repetition there. Here, there's only repetition because it comes after Va'atat Tetzaveh, and we want people to notice it stands out. So therefore, they say, Lacharea, there's no doubling up of anything. So that source makes no sense according to the way you explained it for Abaye. So how can you possibly understand this? Kofla b'Shabbatot. You could explain that as being you double it by Shabbatot, and therefore Hanami kofla b'Shabbatot, and that will explain both lefaneh and lacharea. What does it mean kofla b'Shabbatot? What we mean is not if it comes out that week is Atat Tetzaveh, and we're going to read the parsha. But if you remember yesterday, we saw that there were 2 approaches. Do you only read the parsha as the Haftorah and the Maftir, which is what we really do, and that's what we seem to be discussing right now? Or do you read the entire parsha as Shkalim, right? The whole parsha, you split up Shkalim into 7 sections. So according to this, what it's saying is Kofla b'Shabbatot, if you end up, or this, the truth is, this isn't even relevant whether it's you say that or not, but it did come up in that discussion. But anyway, we'll leave that aside really. But the issue is, if let's say you're on the parsha before or after, and then that means that the next week or the previous week you read Kitisa, you read it again. In other words, it doesn't matter. You don't say, oh, I read it last week already, I don't need to read it again, or I'm going to read it next week, so I don't need to read it again. No, you read it another week. So therefore, that's what it's coming to say. And that works with both options, before, after, and therefore kofla doesn't mean you read it twice that day. It means you read it twice, 2 weeks in a row. That's what it means, kofla b'Shabbatot. Chaliyot, now we're going to have another case. So the first case we dealt with so far today is if the week of Shkalim falls out on Va'atat Tetzaveh. What if Chaliyot b'Kitisa atzma? What if the actual parsha that week is Kitisa? Now what are you going to do? That's a little bit strange. You're going to read it again? If so, how or not? What are you going to do? Amar Rabbi Yitzchak Nafcha, karushita min ve'asita ad vayakel, v'chad kari mikitisa ad ve'asita. He says, it's fascinating, you don't start from the beginning of the parsha. The first 6 aliyot, you read starting from Vasita Kior. You skip the beginning, and then you go back to it at the end, and you say it at the end. Abaye has a big issue with this, and if you remember things we learned in the beginning of Masechet Megillah, Matkifla Abaye hashta amri lemafrehu tekare. People are going to say you're reading the parsha backwards. Remember, you're not allowed to read things out of order. So how could you possibly read this parsha out of order? It seems so strange. So Ela Amar Abai, he says, no, you do as you do this. Kari Shita ad Vayakim, right, which matches what Abai said before. He has no problem with you reading it twice. So read the parsha once in order. Split it up into 6 aliyot. V'chad tanivit, right, until Vayakel, meaning the next parsha. V'chad, and then the last aliyah, tani v'kari mikiti sad v'asita. Then you repeat, the last aliyah is a repeat of aliyah number 1. Tani kavatei Abai, we're going to bring a braita to support this. Chal, because remember, these are amoraim. It's always good if you can bring a Tanaitic source to support. Chaliot b'kitisa atzma, kolinota v'koflinota. If it falls on kitisa, you read it, and then you read it again, which obviously means what we just said. The main topic for now going forward is going to be what days you read it, okay? When each parsha gets read and depending on when the day falls out. Now, we kind of thought that we understood this, and we're going to read it in the Mishnah one more time. So I want to go back to the Mishnah. The Mishnah said, Rosh Chodesh Adar shechal liot b'Shabbat, korim b'Parashat Shkalim. Okay, if Rosh Chodesh Adar falls on Shabbat, you read that day Parashat Shkalim. Chal liot b'toch Shabbat, if it ends up during the week, Rosh Chodesh, makdimin l'sha'avar, you move it a week earlier, umafsikin l'Shabbat acheret. And then what do? You break for a week, right? In the case where it comes out Rosh Chodesh is on Shabbat, there's no break. Why? Aleph is, right? The first of the month is Rosh Chodesh. You read Parshat Shkalim. A week later is the 8th of the month. You read Parshat Zachor already because that week is going to be Purim, right? 7 days later, right? You're going to be on 6 days later is the 14th. 7 days later is the 15th. The 15th is going to come out on Shabbat. Purim on Erev Shabbat. So therefore, you're going to read Parshat Zachor the week after. So when the way we read the Mishnah is, right, if it's on Shabbat, you read Parshat Shkalim. Okay, now break for a minute. If it's in the middle of the week, Makdimin l'Shavar, you read it the week before. Umafsikin l'Shabbat acheret. In that case, you'll have to skip a week, but not in the case where it falls on Shabbat, right? And then Bashniya Zachor, in the second week, and the second week, it sounds like after you've skipped a week, right? The week after that is going to be Zachor. Or in the previous case, right, there is no break at all. So now we're going to try to go in more in depth. We're going to see a bunch of different things about this. Itmar. Now, the assumption is only if it's on Shabbat, do you do it that day. Otherwise, if it's Friday, Thursday, Wednesday, any day in the week, it sounded like you read the Shabbat before. And that's in fact what we do. However, we're going to see that that's a subject of debate if it falls on Friday. Okay, this is always when you draw a line, where exactly do you draw the line? So, Itmar, Rosh Chodesh Adar shechal liot be'erev Shabbat. If Rosh Chodesh falls on a Friday, Rav Amar Makdimin, which is what we thought, you do it the week before. Ushmuel Amar Ma'achrin. Shmuel says, no, you do it the next day. Okay? If Rosh Chodesh is on Friday, you read it on the 2nd of Adar. Okay? It doesn't have to be read on Rosh Chodesh or before. It could theoretically be read on the 2nd of Adar. Not past there, but on the 2nd of Adar, yes. So what's the reasoning? Rav Amar Makdimim de'im came batzru lehu Yomi shulchanot. Remember we said that the money changers set up their tables on the 15th of the month. Well, you need 2 full weeks before. We saw that Shnei Shabbatot of Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, 2 weeks before. We have to announce at least 2 weeks before. If you start on the 2nd of the month, it'll be, if you do 2 weeks before, right, it'll come out a day too late. They already opened their tables on Friday, and you're basically too late. So therefore, we have to do it earlier, even though it comes out a lot earlier. Shmuel Amar Ma'achrin, why? Amar Lecha, Sof Sof Chamesar B'malei Shabta Mikle. Wait a minute. If the 1st is on Friday, the 15th is on Friday, you think they set up their tables on Friday? No. V'shulchanot lo nafkeh b'Shabbat. On that week, on that year, they're not going to set up their tables on Friday because you wouldn't start collecting money on a Friday. It's a weird day to start. And I think about the fact, like in Israel, right? Everything shuts down Thursday afternoon. Nothing's going to start. If you haven't made whatever phone call you need to take care of anything by 4 o'clock Thursday afternoon, that's about it. No one's talking to you until Sunday morning. So likewise, then it seems like Friday was not a day that they were going to, certainly not to start setting up the tables. It would be silly, right? You're going to take out all the money and then it's going to be Shabbat. No one's dealing with that on Friday. So therefore, right, I know it's hard to understand when you're in Chutz La'aretz, everybody goes to work normally outside of Israel, but in Israel, it's really shut down from Thursday afternoon. So he basically says, because of that, you're still going to have your 2 weeks because it's going to start on Sunday that year. So therefore, Shabbat is perfectly fine. And that's why he says, Hilkach ma'achalim. That's why we push it off. So now we're going to bring some questions against Shmuel or possible supports for Rav, right? You can look at it either way. Tanan, let's start with our Mishnah. Chaliyot b'toch Shabbat. What did it say? If it comes out in the middle of the week, makdimin l'shavat u'mafsikin l'shabat acheret. Right? You do it a week earlier, and you have a break of a week. So my love, afilu be'erev Shabbat. Right? It didn't say anything about Friday. It said Shabbat is on one hand, and any other day of the week. Any other day of the week should include Friday. So that sounds like you do it the week before. So the Gemara says, to answer the question against Shmuel, lo b'toch Shabbat dafka. What it meant is in the middle of the week. Friday is not really the middle of the week, and therefore Friday is going to go like Shabbat, and it's just not included when it says in the middle of the week. It meant the middle and not the very end of the week. Tashma. Now we're going to bring a quote from a Tosefta. What we're going to do here is we're going to have the same type of issue when it comes to Zachor. And then in the end, we're going to quote and we're going to see also something in Para. In the end, we're going to quote the entire Tosefta at the end of this whole section. Okay, but right now we're going to see it by bits and pieces, and later we'll see the whole thing. So later you'll say, oh, this sounds familiar. It's because we're reading part of the Tosefta, and then we're going to read the entire thing. So the Tosefta says, Ezu hi Shabbat Rishonah. It's a Tosefta that basically deals exactly like our Mishnah with the 4 different Parshiyot. Kol shechal Rosh Chodesh Adar liot b'tocha v'afilu be'erev Shabbat. Wow, what does this say? When, right, you're going to read this on Shabbat, the Shabbat of the week that Rosh Chodesh falls on, which means the Shabbat before, even if Rosh Chodesh is on Erev Shabbat. That seems very clear. The Erev Shabbat goes with all the other days of the week. So how could Shmuel possibly say something against this Tosefta? And really, it's a proof for Rav, because it's exactly what we said. My love, is this not afilu be'erev Shabbat dumia detofad? Isn't this not saying the Erev Shabbat is just like the middle of the week? Just like when it's during the week, we go back and read it on the Shabbat before. Likewise, on Friday, it sounds exactly like that. So Amar Shmuel ba. Shmuel said that his version of the Tosefta had the word ba instead of bitocha, and it read like this. Ezewi Shabbat Rishonah, Kol Shachar Rosh Chodesh Adar Lihiyot Ba. When do we read the first parsha? When Rosh Chodesh falls on that day on Shabbat, not bitocha. Bitocha means during the week. Here it's saying when it falls on that day. And then it's saying, Va'afilu be'erev Shabbat. You're going to read it on that Shabbat if Rosh Chodesh is that day, or even if Friday is Rosh Chodesh, you're going to read it on the following day. So he has a totally different version of this Tosefta, and that's how they say here, not only Shmuel said this, but in the house of Shmuel, this is how their Braita read, and that would explain Shmuel according to Tosefta. So in order for him to work with the Tosefta, you have to change a word in the Tosefta. Okay, next. Kitinai. Now we're going to just point out. So we had 2 questions against Shmuel. We answered both of them, one from our Mishnah, one from the Tosefta. Now we're going to say that the machloket of Rav and Shmuel here is a machloket between 2 Tanaim as well. Okay, so it's good when you say, oh, not only did these 2 Amoraim debate this, but also 2 Tanaim debated. Makes it stronger. Misalgin l'shabbatot divrei Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. You can skip weeks when it comes to these 4 parshiyot. They don't have to be one right after the other. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar omer emisargin. He says, Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, you don't skip weeks. Now, what does this mean? Well, he says, Amar Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, sometimes you really have to skip weeks. So what does he mean? You don't skip weeks. Ematay ani omer emisargin. When do I think you don't skip weeks? Bizman shechaliot erev Shabbat. Exactly our case. When Rosh Chodesh falls on Erev Shabbat, we don't skip weeks. Now think about it. If you went back a week earlier, for sure you'd have to skip a week before Parshat Zachor, because you'd end up, right? If Friday was Rosh Chodesh, then you're going to read way before, right? You're going to read before even the first of the month. And you need to get to Parshat Zachor is the week before the 14th of the month. For sure, there's going to be an extra Shabbat in there. So therefore, he says, Aval bizman shechaliyot b'toch Shabbat magdim v'korei m'Shabbat shavra af al pi shu Shvat. So what he says is you're going to end up reading in Chodesh Shvat if Rosh Chodesh falls out in the middle of the week. But if it falls on Friday or Shabbat, then there's not going to be a week skipped. So how does it work out? Let's say it's on Friday. So the first of the month is Friday. The 15th of the month, 2 weeks later, right? We really want the 14th, but let's just do it easier. The 15th is going to be 2 exact weeks after on Friday. Thursday is going to be the 14th. you're going to read on the Shabbat before, which is going to come out on day number 9 of the month. And you read Parshat Shkalim on the Shabbat before, which is the 2nd of the month. So you're going to end up not skipping. And that's what Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar said. And that matches Shmuel, who says, Ma'achrim, we push it off a week, rather than the opinion before that says Makdimim, okay? Which is Rav. So Rav's going to match Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, who says we do skip weeks. Because on a week where it comes out on a Friday, he's going to say we do skip because we go back a week rather than forward a week. Bashniya Zachor, we're going to have the same kind of issue with a case about Parshat Zachor. Itma, Purim Shachali Op Erev Shabbat. Here it's a little different. What if Purim falls on Erev Shabbat? Now, generally, right, so Purim's on Erev Shabbat, that means Shushan Purim's on Shabbat. Now, what would we assume? And what we do is we read it the Shabbat before, okay, which is going to come out on the 8th of the month. But we're going to have a machlok at Rav and Shmuel again. Rav Amar Makdimim Parshat Zachor to the 8th of the month. Ushmuel Amar Ma'achrin. Shmuel says, no, we say it on Purim itself. Okay, it's hard for us to imagine. It's, again, a good example of things you're just not used to. But according to him, you read Parshat Zachor on the 15th. So let's understand why he says this. Rav Amar Makdimin ki echi delo tiktam asiyah l'zechira. We want to first mention that we have to get rid of Amalek and then do it. Now, what exactly do? We don't exactly wipe out Amalek, but do the celebration of Purim that celebrates the victory over Amalek. Okay, so it makes sense first to mention it and then to do actions that are associated with it. Shmuel, and that's why if the 14th is Friday, we definitely have to do Parshat Zachor before. Shmuel Amar Ma'achrin, Amar Lecha, he could explain himself. He's not here to explain himself. Amar Lecha always means we're going to put words in his mouth, but we're going to assume that he says this. Since even though, and this is very interesting, even though, let's say you're not living in a city where it's a walled city, you're living somewhere else, and you've already celebrated your Purim. But since there are people living in walled cities who haven't yet celebrated Purim, the doing and the mentioning happens at least for some people at the same time, and that's sufficient. So basically he's saying, now he would obviously say if your Dalid fell, if Purim itself fell on Shabbat, you read Parshat Zachor on Shabbat. And even if the 15th falls out, that's enough to say, at least we have some sort of mentioning of Zechira happening at the same time as Asiyah, and that's fine. So number one, he doesn't care they happened before. And number two, he even doesn't care. And that's, he doesn't even need it to happen before. As long as it happens at the same time, it's fine. And not only that, but even if it happens at the same time for some people, even though you've celebrated Purim already, it's still sufficient. Okay, so he actually pushes it off. So now we're going to have, again, questions on Shmuel. Tanan, Bashniya Zachor. Remember it said in the Mishnah, the second week is Zachor, and this is why I read the Mishnah before, because it's a little tricky. It sounds like you don't skip weeks, right? It sounded like only skip weeks if it falls out, if Rosh Chodesh is on Shabbat, but otherwise, if Rosh Chodesh is on Shabbat, you don't skip weeks. Remember, that's what we said? You don't skip weeks at all. Only if it's during the week and you have to do it earlier, do you skip weeks. So now let's figure this out. Ki mikla reish yarcha b'Shabbat. If Rosh Chodesh is on Shabbat, and we said you don't have to skip weeks. Now let's calculate. Mikla Purim be'erev Shabbat. If the first, right, remember, count 7 days, 1st, 8th, and 15th are all going to be on Shabbat. That means on that year, where's Rosh Chodesh going to be? Where's Purim going to be? The 14th, on a Friday. That's exactly our case. Now, our Mishnah, the way I read it before, seemed to indicate you only skip weeks when it comes out during the week, not if it comes out on Shabbat, because we said you read the 1st, you read Shkalim, the 8th, you read Zachor, and the 15th, right, is already past Purim. But again, past Purim if you don't live in a walled city. And you obviously don't read the Zachor. But now, according to Shmuel, you do read Zachor, even if you don't live in a walled city. So now you're going to have a week skip there. And that's not what the Mishnah said, right? So now they say, Bashniya Zachor, which sounded like the week after Shkalim, if Shkalim fell out on Shabbat, if Rosh Chodesh fell on Shabbat, you basically would skip a week. So they say, Amar, Papa, my Shniya l'hafsaka. No, they mean no matter what, you skip a week. And what it means, Bashniya, it means the second week after skipping. Okay, you skip 1 week, week number 2. And therefore, you're going to basically end up with a week skipped also when it's Shabbat. And you can read that into the Mishnah. Again, it's not the simple reading of the Mishnah, but you could, right? It's sort of where you put the period. If you want to go back to the Mishnah and see it, you'll see it inside. Again, Rosh Chodesh Adar Chal Liot b'Shabbat Korim Parashat Shkalim. Chal Liot b'toch HaShabbat Makdimim l'Shavar. Period. Right? You do it a week earlier. Then it says Mafsikin l'Shabbat Acheret. And then that would apply to both cases. Right? It's all just a matter of how you punctuate. And then it says Bashniya Zachor after you've skipped. So you could read the Mishnah in that way, even though we didn't originally. Tashma, now we're going to have another source. And this is again taken from this Tosefta that we're going to read soon in its entirety. Ezo Shabbat Shniya, what's the second week, right? What's the second parasha? Kol shachal Purim liot b'tocha v'afilu be'erev Shabbat. Right? It's the Shabbat before Purim happens, whether or not Purim's during the week or even on Friday. Now that seems to be very clear, Rav. So we're going to have the exact same answer we had last time. Amar Rav Huna. I'm sorry, skip. My love, Erev Shabbat dumiyad tochama makdimim Erev Shabbat makdimim. This seems to say very clearly, Friday is just like every other day of the week, and you're going to do it the week before and not the week after, like Shmuel said. Amar Shmuel ba v'chein tana debei Shmuel ba. Remember, Shmuel already changed the word in the Braita earlier. Obviously, in this part, on the Tosefta, the Tosefta also is going to change it, and he's going to say ba, which means no, it meant. When do you read Zachor? When it falls on Shabbat, okay? When Purim is on Shabbat, and even if Purim's on Erev Shabbat, you're going to do it that day and not the week before, okay? Amar Rav Huna. L'divrei hakol, now we're going to have a machloket. I'm sorry, I skipped a few words. Chal liot b'Shabbat atzma. What if Purim falls on Shabbat, which is the way we just read this Braita? What if Purim falls on Shabbat itself? Yud Dalet is on Shabbat. So Amar Rav Huna, l'divrei hakol ein makdimim. Everybody agrees then that you actually read Zachor on Purim. Okay, we don't do this. First of all, we never have Purim on Shabbat, only Shushan Purim, which was the first example we gave. But in any case, we don't hold like Shmuel in any of these cases. But he says, everyone would agree that you would actually read it on Shabbat if that were the case. Rav Nachman Amar Adayin Hi Machloket. Rav Nachman says, no. The same Machloket would still stand. Rav would still say you have to do it a week earlier because the Sechira can't come at the same time as the Asiyah. You have to have it before, which would then be a week before. Itmar Nami, also to support that Rav Nachman says it's still a machloket, it was said, Amar Rabbi Chia bar Abba, Amar Rabbi Abba, Amar Rav, Purim shachal liot b'Shabbat, makdim v'koreh b'Shabbat she'avra zachor. Here, and Amar says it explicitly, in the name of Rav, that if Purim falls on Shabbat, we'd read it a week before. And there you see that Rav actually still held the way we claim that he held, and not according to Rav Huna, who thinks that even Rav would say you do it on Purim itself. And he only disagrees, right? According to Rav Huna, he only disagrees if it's Shushan Purim on Shabbat and you've already celebrated Purim, that would be a problem. But if your day is that day, then theoretically, right, according to at least Rav Huna, even Rav would agree you say it on you read Parshat Zachor on Purim. Again, these are things that are hard for us to get our head around because we're so used to what we know to be the case. B'shlishit paraduma. What we're going to do here is, this is a little simpler than the last few, which is bring a Braita and bring something an Amora said. There's going to be a seeming contradiction. In the end, we're going to say it's not really a contradiction. They're just talking about different scenarios. Tanu Rabbanan. Ezu hi Shabbat Shlishi. When do we read Parshat Parah? Kol shesmucha lePurim me'achareha. Okay, whatever week Purim comes, right? It's the week after Purim is. Itmar, but it was said by an Amora, Rabbi Chana bar Rabbi Chanina Amar, Shabbat esmucha leRosh Chodesh Nisan. It's the week before Rosh Chodesh Nisan. So either it's the week after Purim or it's the week before Chodesh Nisan. How could that be? V'lo pligi. Ha de'ikla Rosh Chodesh Nisan b'Shabbat. Ha de'ikla be'emtza Shabbat. If Rosh Chodesh Nisan comes out in the middle of the week, right, then, or let's do it this way. If it falls out on Shabbat and you read Parshat HaChodesh on Shabbat, then you can't read it the week after Purim because that'll be too early. We want to have it next to Parshat HaChodesh. So we're going to push it off a week and read it the week next to Nisan. But if Rosh Chodesh Nisan is during the week, that means Parshat HaChodesh is going to be earlier. That means that there's going to be an overlap between the week before Nisan, right? You're going to end up the week after Purim is going to be a week before Parshat HaChodesh. Okay. And then it's going to work out fine. So it all depends on what the week, right? What the year and what days everything came out on. On the fourth week, you read Parshat HaChodesh, right, which we just read in the Parsha, about this month is the first month for you, etc. That's all about Nisan. So we read it before Rosh Chodesh Nisan or on Rosh Chodesh Nisan. So now we're going to finally quote this entire Braita, and we're going to see what we read on each of these days, what the Haftorah is, and then we'll move on. Tanu Rabbanan. Rosh Chodesh Adar shachal liot b'Shabbat. Kor'in ki tisa u'maftirim b'Yehoyada. This, we've seen all these parts quoted before, right? Where we brought this as a question to the one who says not ki tisa, because this says, right, you read ki tisa, your haftorah is Yehoyada, which was also about collecting the money for the Mishkan. Ve'ezu hi Shabbat Rishona. When do you read this? Kol shachal Rosh Chodesh Adar liot b'tocha. Remember, there was either to say it's b'tocha or ba. We'll read it the way Rav reads it, which is whatever the week that Rosh Chodesh is going to happen in, right? You read it on the Shabbat before that. Afilu be'erev Shabbat, even if it's on a Friday, you're still going to read it the week before. Bashniya, the second week, Zachor. Umaftirim pakadati, which is the whole story of Amalek and Shaul. Ve'ezu hi Shabbat shniya. What's the second week? When does it come out? How do you calculate? Kol shachal purim liot b'tocha v'afilu be'erev Shabbat. Whatever week Purim falls out on, even if it's going to be a Friday, it's going to be the Shabbat before that. Again, this is all Rav. Right? Again, Shmuel would have to change the word b'tocha to ba, and then it would be talking specifically about Shabbat and not about during the week. Ve'ezu hi Shabbat, v'shlishi, third week, para aduma, right, which is all about getting purified before the Korban Pesach. That's why we read it closer to Nisan. Umaftirim v'zarakti alechem, which is about God purifying us. Ve'ezu Shabbat Shlishit. When do we read it? Kol shesmucha lePurim me'achareha. Right. This was the version that we read before, which is the week after Purim. Okay. Which again, depending on when we read Parshat HaChodesh, would affect whether it's really that week or the week after. B'revi'it HaChodesh hazeh, in the fourth week, we read the one about Rosh Chodesh, or about Rosh Chodesh Nisan. Umaftirim Ko Amar Hashem Elokim Barishon Be'echad LaChodesh, which is a haftorah that talks about on the first day of the first month, which is Chodesh Nisan. So we read that. Ve'ezu hi Shabbat Revi'it, and when does this fall out? Kol shachal Rosh Chodesh Nisan liot b'tocha. Whenever Rosh Chodesh Nisan is in that week, in other words, again, the week before Rosh Chodesh Nisan. Va'afilu be'erev Shabbat, and even if Rosh Chodesh Nisan comes out on a Friday, it will be almost an entire week before. Now we're going to go back to the Mishnah, and the Mishnah had said, after it mentions the 4 weeks, then it says, and then we go back to the regular reading. So we saw already yesterday, there's a machloket. What does it mean we go back to the regular reading? L'seder mai. Rabbi Ami amar l'seder parshiyotu chozer. Rabbi Ami says, we don't read the regular parsha, and this disagrees with what we saw in the beginning of today's daf. According to Rabbi Ami, when Parshat Shkalim comes, HaChodesh, Zachor, whatever, para, you stop the regular reading. You don't read Parshat Shavua that week. You read only, you split up into 7 aliyot, the section that you're supposed to read for that week. Rabbi Yomi Amal, l'seder haftarotu chozer. No, it's just the haftorah and the maftir, which goes with haftorah, the last aliyah and the reading from the Nevi'im, from the prophets. That is changed. And when it says we go back to the regular reading, it means you go back to the regular haftorah that connects with that week's parsha, as opposed to these weeks where you have your own special haftorah and maftir. Amar Abaye, kavatei de Rabbi Ami mistaba. He says, look, it really makes more sense to say that they did a whole separate parsha that week, and they didn't read the regular parsha. How so? Titnan, as it says in the Mishnah, okay, right after it says, okay, if you look back, it's hard to do this. You have to just keep going back. You have to look in the Mishnah. The Mishnah said, "B'chamishit chozrin lekesidran." You go back to your regular order, and then immediately it says, "B'rashei chodeshim b'Chanukah b'Purim b'Taniyot b'Mamadot b'Yom Kippurim." Sorry, I skipped a word. Lakom mafsikim. For everything you stop, and as it talked about mafsikim here, right? You go back chozrin lekesidran after you stopped your regular reading, and then it says, for all these other days we stop. In other words, here mafsikim means we don't read the regular Torah reading. We read something unique for that day. What days is that? Rosh Chodesh, Chanukah, Purim, fast days, Ma'amadot, where we read about the creation of the world, and Yom Kippur. We said it's referring to Mincha of Yom Kippur. Okay, and Lakom Mafsikim we actually said is referring to all the holidays, right? On Pesach, on Sukkot, on all those. There's a separate Torah reading. Now, clearly, the subject of that is Torah reading and not Haftorah, and therefore they assume that since it says there Lakom Mafsikim, and the words right before it was Chozrim, we go back to the regular reading, it must be that they're talking about the same readings in that line and in that line. So that's what the Gemara is going to say. Abaye is going to say. Which appeared immediately after we go back to our regular reading. And then they say, therefore, if assuming that these are all talking about the same thing, then we say, if we stop the regular Torah readings and go back to them after reading the 4 parshiot, and then in addition, we stop the regular Torah readings for all these other things, then obviously you can't fill in the blank. You have to fill in Seder Parshiot. You can't fill in the blank Haftorahs because there aren't Haftorahs on all these days. When we say Rosh Chodesh, we don't do the regular Torah reading. There is no Haftorah for Rosh Chodesh. Again, if it falls on Shabbat, yes, there is. But we're not talking about that. We're talking about on a regular Rosh Chodesh, when they're on a weekday, then you have a special reading. When it's Hanukkah, you have a special reading. When it's all these days, you have special readings, and they come in place of, let's say it's a Monday. You don't read the Parsha that you normally read on Monday. You read this instead. Can't be talking about Haftorahs, so therefore the line before must also not have been talking about Haftorahs. That's a certain assumption they make. Ela lamanda amal l'seder haftarot uchazer haftara b'chol mi'ika. There is no Haftorah on a weekday, so it can't possibly be referring to Haftorahs. V'idach. So what is the person who said, Rabbi Yirmiyahu said it is Seder Haftarot? What will he say? Hakadita v'hakadita. You don't need to make an assumption. You can say when it says Chozriv l'Sidran, the first part of the Mishnah was talking about the 4 parshiot. There we go back to our regular Haftorah reading the following week. Then it started another topic which says Lakom Afsikim. When you're talking about Torah readings, there's special days where we substitute a different Torah reading instead of the regular Torah reading. And then those 2 parts of the Mishnah don't necessarily have to be talking about the same thing. And that's how you can read the Mishnah. Okay, this is why, by the way, you end up, because we read special Torah readings and not the Shabbat Torah reading on holidays, special days, etc. That's why we end up sometimes in Israel and outside of Israel having a different Torah reading, right? There ends up sometimes with Parshiot are messed up because, let's say, the 8th day of Pesach comes out on Shabbat. So the 8th day in Chutz La'aretz, it's Pesach. They have a special Pesach Torah reading. And in Israel, they're reading the next week's Parsha. So that causes sometimes they're off until we actually fix it with a double Parsha. One place reads a double, one place doesn't, and then we resolve the issue. But that comes all from this. So anyway, we have this machloket, and then that basically means we have 2 ways of reading the Mishnah. And is the first part connected and they're talking about the same topic as the second? Or can you say, no, it's talking about something different? The 4 parshiot, it was really just for Maftir and Haftorah, and the other ones, it was right. And again, Maftir and Haftorah is not like we do it, but it was actually Aliyah number 7 rather than an extra Aliyah. Even though we did see in the Gemara that it's supposed to be an extra Aliyah, but obviously there were different opinions about it. Now they ask a question about fast days. And from here, we're going to get to a sugya that we saw already in Ta'anit. B'Taniyot, lama li hafsaka? Why do you have to break the regular Torah reading in Ta'aniyot? They knew that they read from the Torah in the afternoon on Ta'aniyot, on fast days. So they suggest, let's say Ta'anit comes out on a Monday. Why don't why don't you read in the morning the regular Torah reading for Monday, right? That week's portion of the Torah. And in the afternoon, read the part for the Ta'anit, and then you don't have to skip the one you usually do. So, they say this must support Rav Huna, the Amar Rav Huna, Mitzafra Knufia. They didn't actually, according to Rav Huna, they didn't actually read the Torah in the morning. And that's why they don't replace it, right? Nowadays we do, but in those days they didn't. And that's why that's why we can't do both, because there's only Torah reading in the afternoon. And therefore there's only one, and therefore it has to be about the fasts. So what did Rav Huna say? Mitzafra Knufia. What would people do in the morning of a fast? They would get together. If you remember this, Hechi Abdina, what would they do when they got together? Amar Abaye, Mitzafra Lepalge di Yoma, Ma'inina b'mile demata. The first half of the day, you start looking around what's going on in the city, what's wrong, where are the problems, so that people can start working on repenting. Mipalge di Yoma lepanya, from the second half of the day, what do you do until evening? Riva di Yoma, a quarter of that time, Kari Maftere. You read from the Torah and you do the Maftir. The Riva di Yoma, and a quarter of the day, Ba'arachamim. You ask for Rachamim. So the second half of the day, basically, it's the reverse of what we normally think of. The second half of the day, you're praying. Shnei, how do we know this? Well, it comes up in Sefer Ezra. It says, "Vayikalu b'Sefer Torat Hashem Elokechem revi'it hayom u'revi'it mitvadim u'mishtachavim." This split of a quarter praying and a quarter reading the Torah that you see in Ezra. To which they say, "V'ipoch ana." Why don't you then say, well, at least they did that quarter and that quarter in the morning, and in the afternoon they checked the mile demata. Say lo salkadatach, because it says there, "Ve'elai yasfu kol charei b'divrei Elohei Yisrael amal hagolah," and everyone should come to me, gather into me. V'ani yoshev mishomem ad minchat ha'erev, and I'm sitting mishomem silently, or I'm not sure how to translate that word, but until mincha, until the afternoon. Okay, here's a good explanation. Thank you, Ruth. Stunned. Okay, I sat stunned until mincha, until the evening. And what did they say? It says there, the assumption is he was bowing then, and he was doing the prayer at the end of the day. And therefore, it must be, we learned from there that they split, how they split the day, and which the order should be. We also learned in Tani that it also makes sense to first figure out what the problems are and then start fixing them. Okay, new Mishnah. And with this, we'll read part of the Mishnah today, and then we'll finish up the Mishnah tomorrow because part of it's in tomorrow's daf. Pesach. Now we're going to have a list of what we read on each day. Pesach korim beparashat moadot shel Torat Kohanim. We read what we call Parshat Emor, which is list in the end of Sefer Vayikra. There's a list of all the holidays, what you do to celebrate all the holidays. We read all of that on Pesach. Be'atzeret Shiva Shavuot. Now the assumption here is that one would think that you would really read this on all the holidays, and we're going to see that you read the Parshat Emor where it lists what you do on all the holidays. But Shavuot comes 7 weeks after, and there's no reason, and some people even view, it's called Atzeret, which is like Shmini Atzeret. It sort of ends Pesach, and therefore there's no reason to repeat the exact same Torah reading we just repeated, and therefore you read a section which talks about the Shiva Shavuot of Shavuot, right? And there it also makes mention of all the holidays. So we read that as an alternative because you don't want to read the same thing. Rosh Hashanah, by the way, I wanted you to notice what's missing here. Doesn't talk about what we read on Chol HaMoed of Pesach, which each day it's something different, and there's no clear cut thing what to do. It's interesting they skip it because you're going to see they do mention Chol HaMoed Sukkot. So I'm just raising that as a question right now. Rosh Hashanah b'chodesh hashvi'i be'echad lachodesh. Okay, there you read where it's the part that talks about Rosh Hashanah, which also we don't do, right? We read the part Hashem B'Chadat Sarah, right? We read about the Akedah. We don't read, the Akedah is on Yom Kippur. We read, right, two different sections, or maybe, we read about Akedah Ishmael, right? Now I'm totally blanking. So I was having spoon. I'm in the middle of teaching, but we don't actually do that reading. But we read it at a certain point, but not there, right? We do read the Akedah. Okay. I was getting confused for a minute, whether that was Yom Kippur or not. Okay. Thank you no, Yom Kippur, obviously we read Acharei Mot. Okay. So sorry that I got confused. So we read Hashem B'Chadat Sarah and we read the Akedah. Okay. Next. B'Yom Kippurim Acharei Mot. Okay. In Yom Kippurim, we read the Avodat Yom Kippurim. B'Yom Tov Harishon Shel Chag Korim B'Parashat Moadot Shebetorat Kohanim. Okay. On the first day of Sukkot, we read exactly what we read on the first day of Pesach. I guess by that point, 6 months had passed. It's sufficient. Ubishar Kol Yomot HaChag B'Korbanot HaChag. And all the other days, we read the korban that you bring on that day. B'Chanukah B'Nisim. B'Purim, okay, we read about the Nisim because they all brought gifts for the Chanukah to Mishkan. B'Purim Vayavo Amalek, right? So Chanukah, even though Chanukah is not mentioned in the Torah, so they need to find some sort of Chanukah connected with the Chanukah, the sanctification of the Mikdash, of the Mishkan. B'Purim Vayavo Amalek, because that's to do with Amalek, right? Purim is getting rid of Amalek. So we mentioned where Amalek appears in the Torah. B'Rosh Chodeshim u'Rosh Chodeshim, we read the sacrifices. B'Mamado b'Maseh Bereshit, we read about the creation of the world. And here we'll stop, and we will pick up tomorrow on what these sections we read. Maybe we'll get back to the issue of what's missing here, and we're going to get to in the Gemara about the different possible readings for Rosh Hashanah. So we'll stop here for today, but more to be said on this topic going forward. Have a great day, everyone.